There's a specific kind of quiet you only find in the high timber of the Sawtooth Range, at Iacin and Oppos. The absence of sound, but rather the presence of everything else. The low hum of the Snake River cutting through granite, the wind scrubbing the needles of ancient Douglas firs, and the steady, rhythmic groan of a house settling into the mountain. I've lived in that quiet for 22 years, in a cabin I built with my own two hands, one timber, one paycheck, and one blister at a time. And for 2 decades, the only neighbors I had to worry about were the elk and the occasional curious black bear. But all of that changed on a Tuesday in late October, when I drove back from a supply run and found my world chained shut. I pulled my truck up to the edge of the ravine, and for a second I thought I was in the wrong place, because stretched across the mouth of the heavy timber and steel bridge that serves as the only lifeline to my property was a thick, industrial-grade chain, bolted directly into the concrete footings I'd poured myself back in the late 90s. Hanging from the center of that chain was a bright, obnoxious sign featuring a logo I recognized from the suburban sprawl 5 miles down the valley. The Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and in bold, aggressive letters, it said in quote, "Private access revoked. Unauthorized structure on HOA land." End quote. My heart didn't oppose. Race, it went cold, a slow, heavy freezing that happens when you realize that the world you've spent half a lifetime protecting has just been invaded by people who think a laminated sign is more powerful than a deed. And as I stepped out of the truck, the smell of fresh-cut metal and ozone hit me. They hadn't in Oppos. Just chained it. They'd use a grinder to drill new holes into my bridge, and that was the moment I knew this wasn't Oppos. Just a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war. I'm Ben Miller, a man who spent 40 years in structural engineering before retiring to the woods to get away from exactly this kind of bureaucratic nonsense. And as I stood there looking at that chain, I noticed a tiny glint of light tucked into a patch of huckleberry bushes near the bridgehead. I walked over, my boots crunching on the frost, and pulled back the branches to find a high-end trail camera aimed directly at the bridge. And that's when the quiet of the mountains felt different. It felt watched, it felt predatory, and I realized that whoever did this was probably sitting in a climate-controlled office right now, waiting for me to lose my temper. But I didn't. I just took a deep breath, pulled a notepad from my pocket, and wrote down every detail of the damage while the mountain air turned sharp and the river below whispered like it was mourning the loss of its own peace. The long hike through the woods to get to my porch was brutal on my 60-year-old knees, and by the time I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, I found the welcome home gift they'd left in my mailbox, a thick, cheap envelope stuffed with notice of boundary reassessment, and a demand for backdated dues totaling nearly $12,000. I've seen bad paperwork in my life, but this was a masterpiece of fiction, including a map that looked like it had been drawn by someone who'd never actually stepped foot on a mountain, showing my property line, bending like a wet noodle just to encompass my bridge and the riverbank. I called the number at the bottom, and a woman answered with the kind of rehearsed, sugary sweet venom that makes your skin crawl, introducing herself as Regina, the HOA board president, and before I could even finish my sentence, she cut me off with, "Mr. Miller, we've updated our jurisdictional maps to reflect the natural riparian expansion, and since your bridge now falls within our community buffer zone, it's been deemed a liability and a violation of our aesthetic standards." I leaned back in my chair, watching the shadows of the pines stretch across my floor, and I said, "Regina, my deed is older than your development, and my bridge was permitted by the county before you even broke ground on your first McMansion," But she just laughed, a short, dry sound that reminded me of a paper shredder. She told me that community standards, had evolved, that their legal team had, reinterpreted, the easement, and that if I didn't end Oppos, pay the fines and sign over the maintenance rights to the bridge within 10 days, they'd have it demolished as a safety hazard. I hung up the phone and sat there in the dark for a long time, not because I was scared, but because I was calculating, and I realized that Regina and her board-wearing and Oppos, just after my money. They wanted my bridge because it provided the only shortcut to the northern ridge where they were planning to build Phase 3 of their development. and my private property was the only thing standing between them and a multi-million-dollar expansion. The next morning, the escalation began in earnest, and when I hiked back down to the bridge, I saw they'd gone a step further, installing a heavy steel gate across the entrance, complete with a, condemned, notice signed by a guy named Howard Vane, who claimed to be a licensed civil engineer. I've been in the industry long enough to know the names of every reputable firm in the state, and Howard Vane sounded like a name someone would pull out a bad detective novel. So I spent the afternoon digging through state licensing records while the anger burned a hole in my stomach. It didn't end Oppos take long to find the truth. Vane had lost his license 6 years ago for falsifying soil samples on a bridge project that nearly collapsed in a neighboring county. And yet here he was being paid by Regina to sign off on the, structural instability, of a bridge that I knew for a fact was strong enough to support an M1 Abrams tank. That's when I called my old friend Elias, a retired surveyor who's forgotten more about Montana land law than most lawyers will ever know. And when he arrived at the trailhead with his GPS rigs and his old-school transit, he looked at the gate and spit a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. We spent the day crawling through the brush, finding the original brass markers I'd set decades ago. And as the sun began to dip below the peaks, Elias looked at his digital readout and just shook his head, telling me that not only was the bridge entirely on my land, but the, HOA buffer zone, they were claiming was actually a piece of unallocated federal easement that the HOA had no more right to than the King of England. We were standing there, documenting the coordinates, when a white SUV with a Whispering Pines logo on the door pulled up, and out stepped Regina, looking every bit the part of suburban warlord in her designer hiking boots and a clipboard. You and Oppos, re-trespassing on a condemned site, Mr. Miller, she shouted, her voice echoing off the canyon walls, and when I told her that I was standing on my own land and that her, engineer, was a disgraced fraud, she didn't end Oppos to even flinch. She just looked at Elias and told him his license would be under review for, assisting in unauthorized land interference, It was the most arrogant display of manufactured power I'd ever seen, and as she drove away, she yelled out the window that the demolition crew would be there by Monday, and I realized that I couldn't end Oppos. Just won a legal battle. I had to destroy the very foundation of her authority before she could tear down the bridge I'd built for my family. Saturday was when the, accident, happened, the one that changed the tone of the whole fight, because I was trying to hike a steep, unofficial game trail to get some supplies around their blockade when the frost-slicked shale gave way under my boots. I took a nasty tumble, sliding 30 feet down a ravine and slamming my shoulder into a cedar trunk, and as I lay there in the cold, listening to the river and feeling the blood soak into my shirt, I didn't in Oppos feel pain as much as I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. I managed to crawl back to the house, but that injury became the first real nail in the HOA and Oppos as coffin, because when the doctor at the ER documented the grade 3 shoulder separation and the lacerations, it wasn't Oppos, just a medical report. And it was evidence of, physical harm caused by the unlawful obstruction of a primary residence in Oppos, as only egress, While my shoulder was throbbed in a sling, I decided it was time to play a little game of my own, and I called a couple of buddies from my old construction crew, men who hate bullies even more than they hate working on a Sunday, and we spent the afternoon assembling what I like to call, the Trojan Art Project. We used some scrap PVC piping, a few empty 55-gallon drums, a gallon of neon pink paint, and some plywood to build the most hideous, structurally impossible, observation deck, right at the edge of the disputed easement, making it look like I was starting a major construction project. We even put up a sign that said, future site of the Ben Miller Recreational Piggery and Compost Center, permit pending, and I knew that for a woman like Regina, who obsessed over property values and, curb appeal, this would be like a red cape to a bull. She took the bait within 3 hours, and by Monday morning, my trail cameras caught her and a group of HOA board members standing at the edge of the property, gesturing wildly at my pink and plywood monstrosity while they filmed it with their phones. She was so blinded by her own rage that she didn't and oppose. TC the real move I was making, which was having Elias and a team of state environmental specialists document the fact that the HOA had cleared a massive swath of protected riparian vegetation on their side of the river to make room for their Phase 3 road. It turned out that in her rush to, end quote, conquer, end quote, my bridge, Regina had ignored every environmental regulation in the book, thinking that because she ran the HOA, she ran the river too, but the Montana Department of Environmental Quality doesn't and oppose. Take care about your golf course views. The real climax happened on a Tuesday, exactly 1 week after I'd found the chains, when I heard the heavy rumble of a diesel engine at the trailhead and looked through my binoculars to see a flatbed truck carrying a skid steer loader and 2 guys with oxyacetylene torches. They were there to cut the bridge, but I was already waiting for them, sitting in a lawn chair right in the middle of the span with a thermos of coffee and a folder full of documents that would make a Supreme Court justice weep. When Regina showed up to oversee the, end quote, demolition, end quote, she looked at me like I was a fly she was about to swat, telling me that the police were on their way to remove me for obstructing a safety order, and I just smiled and handed her a copy of the temporary restraining order I'd secured from a judge in town at 8 a.m. that morning. But the look on her face when the sheriff's deputy arrived wasn't oppose. Just surprise. It was pure, unadulterated shock because the deputy didn't oppose. Come to arrest me. He came to serve a warrant on Regina for, end quote, criminal mischief and falsification of public records, end quote. It turned out that the, end quote, engineering report, end quote, she'd been using wasn't oppose. Just wrong. It was a total forgery, and Howard Vane, the disgraced engineer, had already folded under questioning, admitting that Regina had paid him $5,000 under the table to write a condemnation report without even visiting the site. As the deputy began to cut the HOA and oppose chains off my bridge with a pair of bolt cutters, the sound of that steel snapping was the most beautiful music I'd ever heard, and Regina stood there in her designer gear, her face turning a shade of purple that almost matched my pink plywood piggery, while her board members began to back away from her like she was radioactive. The fallout was spectacular, and as the news of the scandal spread through the Whispering Pines development, the, end quote, quiet, end quote, neighbors she'd been bullying for years finally found their voices, and within a month, the entire HOA board had been dissolved under the weight of 36 lawsuits. It turns out that Regina had been embezzling from the Community Landscaping Fund to pay for her, end quote, legal maneuvers, end quote, against me, and when the dust finally settled, she didn't end oppose. Just lose her position. She had to sell her house at a massive loss just to cover the legal fees and the restitution she owed for the environmental damage she'd caused to the riverbank. My shoulder eventually healed, though it still aches a bit when a storm is rolling in, but every time I drive across my bridge and hear the solid thump of tires on timber, I'm reminded that some things are worth fighting for, and that the mountain has a way of taking care of people who don and oppose, to respect its boundaries. I still have that pink plywood sign tucked away in my shed as a souvenir, but these days, the only thing hanging from my bridge is a small hand-carved piece of cedar that says, end quote, private property. Trespassers will be introduced to the local wildlife, end quote, and the silence has returned to the sawtooths, better and deeper than it ever was before. I guess the real lesson in all of this is that you should never underestimate a man who has nothing but time, a good lawyer, and a deep-seated hatred for people who think they can buy their way on a land that was never for sale. Now, I gotta ask you, have you ever had to deal with a neighbor or an organization that thought they were above the law, or a situation where a little bit of, end quote, creative, end quote, resistance was the only way to win? Because I'm starting to think that in today and oppose world, the only way to keep your peace is to be ready to protect it with everything you've got, and I'd love to hear how you handled the bullies in your own backyard. So leave a comment below and tell me if you think I went too far with the pink piggery, or if I should have painted it neon green instead. Let's talk about it.